The wheat fields stretched endlessly under the twin suns of Verdania Prime, golden waves dancing in the morning breeze. Will Harper pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face as he walked the familiar paths between his crops. At 62, he had been farming for most of his life, first on Earth and now for the past 15 years on this distant colony world. His boots crunched softly on the dry earth as he checked each section for signs of pest damage or disease. Something glinted between the wheat stalks ahead. Will paused, squinting against the bright sunlight. The reflection came again, a brief flash of iridescent color that seemed out of place among the golden grain. He pushed through the wheat, parting the tall stalks with gentle hands. What he found made him stop breathing for a moment. A tiny creature lay curled in a small clearing no bigger than a house cat. Its scales shimmered with colors that shifted from deep blue to emerald green as the light touched them. Small wings, translucent and delicate as butterfly wings, were folded against its side. The being had a long neck and tail, and its head was shaped somewhat like a lizard, but more elegant, more intelligent somehow. Despite never seeing anything like it before, Will recognized the signs immediately. The creature was dying. Its breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. Its eyes were closed, and its scales had lost much of their luster. Will knelt beside it, his farming instincts taking over. He had saved countless animals over the years, from newborn calves to injured birds. This was no different, even if the animal was unlike anything in Earth's taxonomy. Very carefully, Will scooped the creature into his large, calloused hands. It weighed almost nothing, like holding a handful of feathers. The being stirred slightly at his touch, opening eyes that were the color of deep space, filled with tiny points of light like stars. For a moment, Will felt as if those eyes saw straight through him, understanding him in a way that seemed impossible. Then the eyes closed again and the creature went limp. Will hurried back to his farmhouse, a modest structure built from local stone and imported earthwood. The house sat on a small hill overlooking his fields, with a vegetable garden on one side and a barn on the other. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant Grace was already up and preparing breakfast. She would know what to do. Grace had always been better with the sick animals than he was. The kitchen door was open to let in the cool morning air. Grace Harper stood at the stove, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was stirring something in a large pot, probably the porridge she made every morning. At 58, she was still as quick and capable as the day they had met 35 years ago. She looked up as Will entered, taking in his worried expression and the bundle in his hands. "What have you found now?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Over the years, Will had brought home everything from abandoned kittens to injured wild animals. Grace had learned to expect the unexpected. "I don't know what it is," Will said honestly, gently placing the creature on the kitchen table. "Found it in the wheat field. It's dying, Grace. Starvation, I think, and dehydration." Grace moved closer, her eyes widening as she saw the creature clearly. The scales caught the light from the kitchen window, creating tiny rainbows across the table surface. Even unconscious and near death, the being had an otherworldly beauty that took her breath away. "My goodness," she whispered. "What is it? Does it matter?" Will asked. "Look at it, Grace. It's just a baby and it's starving. We have to try to help." Grace nodded without hesitation. This was why she had married Will Harper all those years ago. His heart was big enough to hold the whole universe, and he never turned away from a creature in need. She moved to the cupboard and began gathering supplies. First, they tried water. Grace held the creature while Will used a small eyedropper to place tiny amounts of water near its mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then the creature's tongue, thin and purple, darted out to catch the drops. Encouraged, they continued until it seemed to have had enough. Next came food. They tried mashed vegetables, but the creature showed no interest. Bread soaked in milk was ignored. Finally, Grace suggested honey mixed with warm milk. The creature's nostrils flared slightly at the smell, and when Will offered it with the eyedropper, the being drank eagerly. "There we go," Grace said softly, stroking the creature's head with one finger. The scales felt warm and smooth like polished stone. "You were just hungry, weren't you?" They made a comfortable bed for the creature in a shallow box lined with soft cloth. Grace placed it near the window where the morning sun would keep it warm but not hot. As they watched, the creature's breathing became steadier and deeper. The scales began to regain some of their shine. "What should we call it?" Grace asked. Will studied the creature. Even sleeping, it seemed to glow with an inner light. When the sunlight hit its scales just right, it looked like it was made of living fire. "How about Ember?" he suggested. Grace smiled. Ember it is. As the day progressed, they took turns checking on their unexpected guest. Each time they approached, the creature seemed a little stronger. By evening, it was able to lift its head and look around with those remarkable star-filled eyes. When Will offered more of the honey and milk mixture, Ember drank with obvious appetite. That night, as Will and Grace prepared for bed, they could hear soft sounds coming from the kitchen. Not distress sounds, but almost like tiny chirps or whistles. They crept to the doorway and peered in. Ember was awake, looking around the kitchen with bright, curious eyes. As they watched, the creature's scales began to glow softly, creating patterns of light that pulsed gently in the darkness. Beautiful, Grace whispered. Will nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges they would face. What did this creature eat normally? Where had it come from? Were there others like it? But those were questions for tomorrow. Tonight it was enough that they had saved a life. As they settled into bed, neither Will nor Grace could have imagined that their simple act of kindness would soon reshape the fate of entire civilizations across the galaxy. 3 weeks had passed since Will found Ember in the wheat field, and the transformation was remarkable. What had once been a dying creature no bigger than a house cat was now the size of a medium dog, though much more graceful and elegant. Ember's scales had grown more vibrant, shifting through brilliant blues, greens, and golds depending on the light and the creature's mood. Grace hummed quietly as she prepared breakfast, occasionally glancing at Ember, who sat near the kitchen window. The creature had developed a routine of watching the sunrise each morning, its scales glowing softly in response to the first light. When Grace moved to the stove, Ember followed, staying close but never getting in the way. Over the past few days, it had begun to understand simple human gestures and even seemed to respond when they called its name. Will entered from the barn, brushing hay from his shirt. "Old Bessie's feeling better this morning," he announced. Bessie was their milk cow, who had been limping for the past week. The local veterinarian was 3 days away by transport, so Will had been treating her himself with limited success. "Oh, good," Grace replied. But then she noticed the concerned look on Will's face. "What is it?" "Well, it's the strangest thing," Will said slowly. "Yesterday, when I was treating Bessie's leg, Ember followed me to the barn. You know how curious it's gotten. Anyway, when I wasn't looking, Ember went right up to Bessie and touched her injured leg with its nose. Just a gentle touch, nothing dramatic." Grace paused in her cooking. "And? This morning, the swelling is completely gone. Bessie's walking normally, like she was never hurt at all." Will scratched his head. "Could be coincidence, I suppose, but the timing seems odd." Ember looked up at them both, those star-filled eyes seeming to understand every word. Then it did something that made both humans freeze. It nodded just once, a distinctly human gesture that it had never been taught. Grace set down her spoon and knelt beside Ember. "Did you help Bessie?" she asked softly. Ember's scales shimmered, and patterns of light began to dance across its surface. The lights pulsed in what seemed like a rhythm, almost like a language. For a moment, Grace felt as if she could almost understand what Ember was trying to say. Over the following days, more unusual things began to happen around the farm. Will noticed that his vegetable garden was growing faster than it ever had before, particularly in the areas where Ember liked to rest during the afternoon heat. The tomatoes were larger and more flavorful, the carrots grew straighter and sweeter, and even the stubborn patch of soil that had never grown anything properly was now producing abundant crops. The other animals on the farm seemed drawn to Ember as well. The chickens, who were normally skittish around strangers, would gather around the creature as it moved through the yard. The old farm dog, Rex, had taken to sleeping next to Ember's makeshift bed, something he had never done with any other animal. Even the wild birds seemed more numerous around the farm, often landing near Ember and chirping as if having conversations. One evening, as Will was repairing a broken fence post, he heard Grace calling from the house. Her voice carried a note of excitement that made him drop his tools and hurry back. He found her in the kitchen staring at Ember with amazement. "Watch this," she said quietly. She pointed to a wilted flower in a small pot on the windowsill, a gift from their neighbor that had been dying despite Grace's best efforts. "Ember, can you help the flower?" Ember approached the pot and gently touched one of its small front feet to the soil. Immediately, the wilted petals began to lift. Color returned to the leaves, and within moments the flower was standing upright and vibrant, looking healthier than it had when it was first given to them. Will sat down heavily in his chair. Grace, what exactly have we been taking care of? Before Grace could answer, they heard the sound of a transport vehicle approaching their farm. Through the window, they could see the official markings of the colonial administration. Will and Grace exchanged worried glances. Official visits were rare and usually meant trouble. Quick, Grace whispered, scooping Ember into her arms. Upstairs now. They hurried to the bedroom where Grace placed Ember in the closet and closed the door most of the way. Stay quiet, she whispered. Please understand, we need you to stay quiet. Ember's scales dimmed to a barely visible glow, and the creature settled into stillness as if it perfectly understood the need for hiding. Director Ross was a thin, nervous man who always seemed to be looking for problems. He entered their kitchen without invitation, his eyes scanning everything with official suspicion. Routine inspection, he announced, though his visits were never truly routine. Reports of unusual activity in this sector. What kind of unusual activity? Will asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Energy readings that don't match known sources. Biological signatures that don't fit standard colonial life forms. Ross pulled out a small scanning device and began moving it around the room. You haven't noticed anything strange lately, have you? Grace busied herself with preparing tea, hoping her hands weren't shaking visibly. Strange how? Unknown animals, unusual plant growth. Anything out of the ordinary. The scanner beeped softly as Ross moved it near the window where Ember often sat. But the readings seemed to be just background noise. Will shrugged. Been a good growing season. Crops are doing well, animals are healthy. Nothing strange about that. Ross spent another 20 minutes searching the house and the immediate grounds, his scanner occasionally beeping but never finding anything significant enough to warrant investigation. Finally, he seemed satisfied that whatever had caused the readings was not on the Harper farm. Keep your eyes open, he warned as he prepared to leave. If you see anything unusual, report it immediately. The safety of the colony depends on citizens staying alert. After Ross left, Will and Grace waited a full hour before retrieving Ember from the closet. The creature emerged calmly, as if it had understood exactly what had happened and why it had been necessary to hide. That night, as they sat in their living room, Ember curled up between them on the sofa. Grace voiced what they were both thinking. This isn't just an unusual animal, is it? Will stroked Ember's smooth scales, feeling the warmth that seemed to radiate from within the creature. No, I don't think it is. But does it matter? Look at it, Grace. Whatever Ember is, it's intelligent, it's kind, and it's helped everything on this farm. Maybe we don't need to understand everything to know that something is good. Ember looked up at them both, and for a moment, Will could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in those star-filled eyes. The creature's scales pulsed gently with warm light, and somehow both humans understood that Ember was trying to say thank you. Outside, the twin moons of Verdania Prime rose over the peaceful farm, casting silver light across fields that grew more abundant each day. None of them knew that deep in space, sophisticated scanners were slowly closing in on their location, or that their quiet life was about to change forever. The message arrived on a frequency that Will's old communications equipment should never have been able to receive. He was in his workshop trying to repair a broken irrigation pump when the radio crackled to life with sounds unlike anything he had ever heard. Complex mathematical patterns mixed with what seemed like voices speaking in languages that hurt his ears to hear. Will adjusted the dials, trying to clear the signal, when suddenly the transmission shifted. Words in standard galactic common began to emerge from the static, fragments of what sounded like military communications. Sector 7 cleared. No Drakmori energy signatures detected. Proceeding to next grid. Confirmed elimination of refugee ship near Centauri Beta. No survivors. High Command reminds all units that Drakmori detection takes priority over all other missions. Will's blood ran cold. He had never heard the word Drakmori before, but something about the tone of these transmissions filled him with dread. He quickly began recording the communications, his farming background having taught him that information was often more valuable than gold. Over the next several hours, as Will listened to the intercepted messages, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The Drakmori were an ancient species, one of the oldest spacefaring races in the galaxy. They possessed abilities that other species could barely comprehend, including the power to manipulate matter and energy at the molecular level. They had once been peaceful, using their gifts to help other worlds flourish and grow. but their very existence had become a threat to the Hegemony Alliance, a coalition of militaristic species who had decided that the galaxy could only be truly controlled if the Drakmori were completely eliminated. For decades, they had hunted the Drakmori across space, destroying their worlds and killing every member of the species they could find. The last known Drakmori stronghold had fallen 3 months ago. According to the intercepted communications, the species was now considered extinct, but the Hegemony continued to scan for energy signatures just in case any survivors remained hidden. Will's hand shook as he turned off the radio. He walked slowly back to the house where he found Grace and Ember in the garden. The creature was resting in a patch of sunlight, surrounded by vegetables that grew taller and more vibrant than anything Will had ever seen. Grace was weeding nearby, occasionally reaching over to pat Ember's head. "Grace," Will said quietly, "we need to talk." Something in his voice made her look up immediately. She saw the fear in his eyes and stood quickly, brushing soil from her hands. "What is it?" Will glanced at Ember, who had lifted its head and was watching him with those intelligent, star-filled eyes. "Not here," he said. "Inside." In their kitchen, Will played back portions of the intercepted transmissions. Grace listened with growing horror as the scope of the galactic genocide became clear. When the recording ended, they sat in stunned silence. "You think Ember is one of them," Grace said finally. "One of these Drakmori. Look at what it can do, Grace, the healing, the way plants grow around it, the intelligence. It fits everything they described." Will ran his hands through his graying hair. "We've been harboring the most wanted being in the galaxy." "It's just a child," Grace said fiercely. "Whatever happened between its people and this hegemony, Ember had nothing to do with it. It was dying when you found it. Just a baby, starving and alone." Will nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "That doesn't matter to them. They're not just killing adults, Grace. They're eliminating an entire species down to the last individual." As if summoned by their conversation, Ember appeared in the kitchen doorway. The creature moved slowly, its scales dim with what looked like sadness. It approached Will and Grace and, to their amazement, began to project images directly into their minds. They saw flashes of space battles, beautiful crystalline cities being destroyed by massive warships, and Drakmori refugees fleeing in desperation. They witnessed the last moments of Ember's parents, who had hidden their child on Verdania Prime before their ship was destroyed by hegemony forces. The images were accompanied by emotions so powerful that both humans found themselves crying. When the mental sharing ended, Ember curled up at their feet, exhausted by the effort of communication. Its scales pulsed weakly, and Will could see that revealing the truth had cost the creature greatly. "Your name isn't really Ember, is it?" Grace asked softly. The creature looked up at her, and suddenly a word appeared in her mind, not heard but somehow understood. "Astral," she said aloud. "Your real name is Astral." The creature's scales brightened slightly, and it nodded once. "Prince Astral," Will added, as more understanding flowed from the creature to him. "You're not just any Drakmori. You're their heir, aren't you?" Astral settled more comfortably between them, and they felt its trust and gratitude washing over them in gentle waves. Despite the danger, despite the fear, the creature felt safe with these two humans who had shown it nothing but kindness. Grace knelt beside Astral and stroked its head. "They'll never find you here," she said firmly. "We won't let them." But even as she spoke, Will was thinking about Director Ross and his scanning equipment. How long before the hegemony realized that their sensors had detected something on Verdania Prime? How long before they sent ships to investigate? Over the next few days, Will threw himself into learning everything he could about hegemony technology and tactics. He discovered that their scanners were incredibly sophisticated but had limitations. They could detect Drakmori energy signatures from great distances, but could be fooled by sufficient interference. They were thorough but not particularly creative, following standard military protocols that assumed their targets would respond with conventional tactics. Will began to formulate a plan. It was risky, probably impossible, but it was the only way he could think of to protect the being that had become like a child to them. He would need help, though. The other colonists would have to know the truth, and he would have to trust that their basic human decency would overcome their fear. The first person he approached was Deputy Marshal Kate Stone, the colony's chief law enforcement officer. Kate was a practical woman in her 40s, who had come to Verdania Prime to escape the bureaucracy of Earth's overcrowded cities. Will found her in her office, reviewing reports from the outer settlements. "Kate, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible," Will began. He told her everything, showing her the recordings and explaining about Astral's true nature. To her credit, Kate listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "Show me," she said finally. Will brought her to the farm, where Astral demonstrated its abilities by healing a sick chicken and causing a dead tree to bloom with new growth. Kate watched in amazement as the creature's scales danced with patterns of light. "My God," she whispered. "It's real." "It's all real. The question is, what do we do about it?" Will asked. Kate was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, she looked up at Will with determination in her eyes. "We protect it," she said simply. "That's what humans do. We protect those who can't protect themselves." With Kate's help, Will began approaching other colonists. Bob Wright, the settlement's engineer, was fascinated by the possibilities of Drakmori technology. Dr. Helen Park, their only physician, was amazed by Astral's healing abilities. One by one, the people of Verdania Prime learned the truth about their unexpected visitor. Not everyone was immediately supportive. Some feared the consequences of harboring a fugitive from galactic law. Others worried about bringing the wrath of the hegemony down on their small colony. But when they met Astral, when they saw its gentleness and intelligence, most of their fears melted away. As word spread through the settlement, something remarkable began to happen. The colonists started working together in ways they never had before, united by their shared secret and their determination to protect the last prince of an ancient people. They began to prepare for the day when the hegemony would inevitably arrive, knowing that when that day came, they would face the most powerful military force in the galaxy, with nothing but human courage and ingenuity. The first sign of trouble came disguised as opportunity. A convoy of official vehicles arrived at Verdania Prime's main settlement, carrying representatives who claimed to be conducting an agricultural assessment for the Colonial Development Authority. Their leader, a tall woman with cold gray eyes who introduced herself as Surveyor Lang, announced that they would be evaluating the colony's farming practices and biological diversity. Will stood with the other colonists in the town square, listening to Lang's presentation. Something about her didn't sit right with him. Her questions were too specific, too focused on unusual plant and animal specimens. When she mentioned conducting comprehensive biological scans of all flora and fauna in the sector, Will felt his stomach drop. "We'll need to examine each farm individually," Lang continued. "Any unusual findings will be documented for the scientific community. This is a tremendous opportunity for your colony to contribute to galactic knowledge." After the meeting, Will hurried back to his farm where Grace and Astral were waiting anxiously. The young Drakmori had grown again over the past weeks and was now the size of a large dog, its scales more brilliant than ever. More importantly, its abilities had continued to develop. Astral could now communicate complex ideas through shared mental images, and had begun showing Will glimpses of Drakmori technology that seemed like magic. "They're not agricultural assessors," Will told Grace as he secured the doors and windows. "They're hegemony scouts. Has to be." Astral's scales flickered with patterns that Will had learned indicated deep concern. The creature approached him and pressed its head against his hand, sharing images of scanning devices far more sophisticated than anything Director Ross had carried. "They'll find you if they scan the farm," Will said to Astral. "We need to get you hidden somewhere their equipment can't reach." But Astral shook its head, a gesture it had learned from watching humans. More images flowed into Will's mind, showing him something that made his eyes widen with amazement. Drakmori technology wasn't just about healing and growing things. It was about reshaping reality itself at the most fundamental level. "You want to teach me?" Will said slowly. "You want to show me how to build something that can fool their scanners?" Astral nodded, its scales brightening with hope. Over the next 3 days, while the hegemony scouts worked their way through the outer farms, Will underwent the most intensive education of his life. Astral shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Drakmori, teaching Will to see matter and energy as malleable things that could be reshaped with the right understanding. Will's workshop became a laboratory where impossible things happened daily. With Astral's guidance, he learned to modify his farming equipment in ways that defied conventional physics. His old irrigation pumps became sophisticated sensor jammers. His fertilizer spreaders were transformed into devices that could create false energy signatures. Even his simple farming tools gained capabilities that would have amazed galactic engineers. Grace watched in wonder as her husband's hands worked with newfound precision, following instructions that came not through words, but through direct mental connection with Astral. The workshop filled with devices that hummed with strange energies, all camouflaged to look like ordinary farm equipment. "The other colonists need to know what we're doing," Grace said one evening as Will collapsed exhaustedly into his chair. "They deserve a chance to prepare." Will nodded. "Tomorrow. We'll gather everyone tomorrow." The next morning, Will and Kate Stone called an emergency meeting in the community center. Every adult colonist was present. Nearly 200 people who had come to Verdania Prime seeking a simple life, far from the complexities of galactic politics. Now they found themselves at the center of the most dangerous situation any of them had ever faced. "The agricultural assessors are hegemony scouts," Will announced without preamble. "They're looking for Astral." The room erupted in worried murmurs, but Kate raised her hand for silence. "Will has a plan," she said. "Let him explain." Will stood beside Astral, who had grown bold enough to appear in public among the colonists who had accepted it as one of their own. "Astral has been teaching me about Drakmori technology. With it, we can turn this entire colony into something the hegemony has never encountered before." Bob Wright, the engineer, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of something?" "A defensive system that uses our existing infrastructure. Our irrigation networks can become power grids. Our communication systems can be turned into sensor arrays. Our farming equipment can be converted into weapons that don't look like weapons." Will gestured to Astral. "The Drakmori weren't just healers and gardeners. They were masters of adaptive technology." Dr. Park raised her hand. "What you're talking about sounds incredibly complex. How can we possibly build something like that in the time we have?" Astral stepped forward, its scales beginning to glow. Without warning, it placed its feet on the wooden floor of the community center. The colonists watched in amazement as patterns of light spread outward from the contact points, flowing through the building's structure like luminous veins. The lights in the room flickered and then stabilized, burning brighter and cleaner than before. The old heating system began running more efficiently. Even the building's foundation seemed more solid, as if the very molecules had been reorganized into a stronger configuration. "Astral can teach all of us," Will said. "Not just me. It can share its knowledge with anyone willing to learn." What followed was unlike anything in human history. For the next 5 days, while the hegemony scouts slowly worked their way toward the Harper farm, the colonists of Verdania Prime underwent a transformation that would have taken decades using conventional technology. Astral moved from building to building, from farm to farm, sharing Drakmori knowledge with humans who proved remarkably adaptable students. The town's water treatment plant became a sophisticated sensor network. The power grid evolved into an energy distribution system that could redirect massive amounts of force. Individual homes gained defensive capabilities hidden within their everyday appliances. Bob Wright proved especially gifted at understanding Drakmori engineering principles. Under Astral's guidance, he converted the colony's mining equipment into devices that could reshape the landscape itself. Dr. Park learned to enhance her medical equipment with Drakmori healing technology, creating instruments that could repair damage at the cellular level. Even the children contributed, their young minds accepting the impossible with the flexibility that adults had lost. They became living conduits for Astral's knowledge, helping to link different systems together in ways that created an integrated whole. Most remarkably of all was what happened to the farms themselves. Will had been right about the agricultural connection. Drakmori technology worked best when integrated with living systems, and the colony's crops became part of the defensive network. Root systems carried information faster than any computer network. Grain fields could store and redirect energy. Even the livestock developed enhanced senses that could detect threats from vast distances. On the 6th day, Surveyor Lang and her team finally reached the Harper farm. They arrived with confidence, expecting to find nothing more than an ordinary agricultural operation. Instead, they found Will Harper working in his fields, looking like any other farmer going about his daily business. "Mr. Harper," Lang said, activating her scanning equipment, "we're here to conduct our biological survey of your property." "Of course," Will replied pleasantly. "Feel free to look around. Nothing unusual here." Lang's scanners immediately began detecting energy signatures unlike anything in their databases. But every reading seemed to come from ordinary farming equipment. The irrigation system showed massive power flows, but only at levels consistent with water pumping. The barn registered exotic energy patterns that matched agricultural processing equipment. Even the fields themselves radiated signatures that could be explained by normal biological processes. For 4 hours, Lang and her team scanned every inch of the Harper property. They detected power levels that should have indicated the presence of advanced technology, but everything they found had a perfectly reasonable agricultural explanation. Their equipment registered biological anomalies, but those could be attributed to the unusually healthy crops that Verdania Prime was known for. Astral spent those 4 hours hidden in plain sight, its natural camouflage abilities enhanced by Drakmori technology that made it appear to be nothing more than an oddly colored farm animal. The scanners passed over it repeatedly without registering anything significant. Finally, frustrated and confused, Lang called off the search. "Your farm shows some unusual readings," she told Will, "but nothing that can't be explained by your agricultural practices." As the survey team prepared to leave, Lang paused and looked around the farm one more time. For a moment, her eyes seemed to focus on Astral, who was lying peacefully in the shade of a large tree. But the Drakmori's camouflage held, and Lang saw only what appeared to be a local animal of no particular interest. After the scouts left, the colonists gathered at the Harper farm to celebrate their success. But Astral's scales were dim with worry, and the images it shared showed massive warships moving through space toward their sector. "The scouts didn't find what they were looking for," Will said grimly, "but that just means they'll send a full military force to investigate. The real test is still coming." Admiral Crone had personally overseen the destruction of 12 worlds in his hunt for the last Drakmori. His flagship, the Dominion's Fist, led a fleet of 30 warships that dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Verdania Prime system. The ships were massive, each one capable of reducing a planet's surface to molten slag within hours. On his command bridge, Crone studied the tactical displays showing the peaceful farming world below. His officers had reported unusual energy readings from this sector, readings that suggested Drakmori technology might still exist somewhere on the planet's surface. He had learned not to take chances with even the smallest possibility of Drakmori survival. "Signal the colony," Crone ordered his communications officer. "Standard evacuation protocol. All inhabitants have 1 hour to report to designated collection points for biological processing." On Verdania Prime, the colonists received the transmission with grim determination rather than panic. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and everyone knew their role in the defense that was about to unfold. Will Harper stood in his wheat field, now transformed into something that looked exactly like grain, but was actually a vast energy collection array. Astral was beside him, no longer hiding its true nature. The young Drakmori had grown to its full adolescent size, nearly as large as a horse, its scales brilliant with patterns of power that flowed like liquid starlight. "You ready for this?" Will asked, placing his hand on Astral's neck. The creature's response came not in words but in shared emotion. Determination, fear, hope, and love flowed between them. Astral was ready to reveal itself to save the humans who had protected it, even if that revelation meant its death. Grace emerged from the farmhouse, now armed with what appeared to be an ordinary farming tool, but was actually a weapon that could channel Drakmori energy into devastating beams. All across the colony, 200 humans prepared to face the most powerful military force in the galaxy, with courage born of simple human stubbornness. "Attention, Verdania Prime." Admiral Crone's voice echoed across the planet. "This is Admiral Crone of the Hegemony Fleet. You have been ordered to evacuate for mandatory biological screening. Any resistance will be met with planetary sterilization." Will picked up his communications device, a simple radio that Astral had modified into something capable of reaching the fleet in orbit. "Admiral Crone, this is Will Harper speaking for the people of Verdania Prime. We decline your generous offer." On the flagship's bridge, Crone's officers exchanged glances. They had never received such a casual refusal from a planet facing annihilation. "Mr. Harper," Crone replied, his voice dangerously calm, "you don't seem to understand your situation. I have 30 warships in orbit above your world. You have farmers with agricultural equipment. Surrender now, and your deaths will be quick. Admiral, Will said, looking across his fields where other colonists were taking their positions. You don't seem to understand our situation either. You're threatening our home, and humans get real particular about protecting what's theirs. Crone cut the communication and turned to his weapons officer. Begin orbital bombardment. Target the main settlement first. The Dominion's fist opened fire with particle beams that could vaporize mountains. The deadly energy lanced down through Verdania Prime's atmosphere, targeting the colony's town center with enough force to obliterate everything within a 5-kilometer radius. The beams struck what appeared to be empty farmland and simply vanished. Report, Crone snapped. Sir, energy discharge confirms successful firing, but impact sensors show no damage to target area. His weapons officer replied, confusion evident in his voice. Fire again, full spread this time. All 30 ships opened fire simultaneously, filling the sky with enough destructive energy to crack a planet's crust. The beams struck the colony and its surrounding farms and disappeared as if absorbed by the Earth itself. On the surface, Will watched through his modified equipment as the orbital bombardment was channeled harmlessly into the planet's core through a network of routes and irrigation channels that Astral had helped them redesign. The wheat fields glowed briefly as they absorbed energies that would have destroyed cities, then returned to their peaceful appearance. Phase 2, Will announced over the colony's communication network. Across Verdania Prime, what had appeared to be ordinary farms revealed their true nature. Grain fields rose from the earth, reshaping themselves into towering structures that bristled with weapons that fired beams of pure force. Irrigation systems became launch rails that hurled projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. Even the livestock had been transformed, becoming living sensors that could track targets across space with impossible accuracy. Bob Wright's mining equipment erupted from underground installations, having been converted into massive defensive platforms that could move and fight with fluid grace. Dr. Park's medical facilities projected healing fields that could repair battle damage almost instantly. But the real surprise was the colonists themselves. Months of exposure to Astral's knowledge had changed them in ways that went beyond technology. They moved with enhanced reflexes, thought with expanded awareness, and fought with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic. Admiral Crone watched in disbelief as his mighty fleet came under attack from a farming world that should have been defenseless. Weapons fire erupted from the planet's surface with accuracy that defied possibility. His ship's shields, designed to withstand the most powerful military weapons known, flickered and failed under assault from converted agricultural equipment. How is this possible? He demanded. His science officer was frantically scanning the planet below. Sir, I'm reading massive Drachmori energy signatures across the entire planetary surface. It's like the whole world has been turned into a single integrated weapons system. Drachmori? Crone's eyes widened. But they're extinct. We made sure of that. Apparently not, sir. On the surface, Astral stood at the center of the defensive network, its body blazing with power as it coordinated the entire colony's efforts. Will could feel the strain the young Drachmori was under, channeling forces that would have challenged an adult of its species. The battle raged for 6 hours. Crone threw everything he had at the planet below, but nothing worked. His most powerful weapons were absorbed or deflected. His fighter squadrons were destroyed by defensive fire that anticipated their movements with impossible precision. Even his attempts to withdraw were blocked by tractor beams that emerged from what looked like innocent farm buildings. Finally, as his fleet was reduced to half its original strength, Crone made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He activated the one weapon he had hoped never to use, a planet-killer device that could destroy entire worlds by destabilizing their cores. Sir, his weapons officer protested, that will eliminate any Drachmori survivors, but it will also destroy valuable agricultural resources and kill innocent civilians. The Drachmori must be eliminated, Crone said coldly. No matter the cost. The planet killer fired, sending a beam of exotic energy toward Verdania Prime's core. For a moment, Will thought they had lost. The beam penetrated all their defenses, reaching deep into the planet's heart. Then Astral did something that no one, not even the young Drachmori itself, had known was possible. Instead of trying to stop the planet killer beam, it embraced it, using its own life force to transform the destructive energy into something else entirely. The beam that was meant to destroy became a beacon that reached across the galaxy, touching the minds of Drakmori survivors who had been hiding in the deepest corners of space. For the first time in decades, the scattered remnants of an ancient people heard the call of their lost prince. They came from 1,000 hidden refuges, emerging from asteroid bases and cloaked ships, from underground cities and dimensional pockets, where they had waded through years of persecution. They came not for revenge, but because a child of their people had found something worth protecting among the humans of a distant farming world. Admiral Crone watched in horror as his sensors detected hundreds of Drakmori ships emerging from hyperspace around his fleet. But these were not the warships he had expected. They were vessels designed for healing and growth, for building rather than destroying. The battle ended not with explosions but with transformation. The Drakmori ships surrounded Kron's fleet and simply changed them. Weapons became tools for construction. Armor became gardens where beneficial plants could grow. Even the crews were transformed, their minds cleared of the hatred and fear that had driven them to commit genocide. Admiral Crone found himself standing on the bridge of a ship that was no longer a weapon of war but a vessel dedicated to healing and growth. His memories remained, but the crushing weight of his crimes was balanced by a new understanding of what the galaxy could become. On Verdania Prime, Will knelt beside Astral, who had collapsed from the effort of calling its people home. The young Drakmori's scales were dim, but its eyes were bright with joy as it felt the presence of its surviving kinfolk. "You did it," Will whispered. "You brought them home." Astral's response was a feeling of gratitude so profound that Will felt tears streaming down his face. But beneath the gratitude was something else, a sense that this was not an ending but a beginning. The transformation of the galaxy did not happen overnight, but it began with a simple ceremony in Will Harper's wheat field. Representatives from a dozen species that had once been part of the Hegemony Alliance now stood alongside humans and Drakmori, watching as Prince Astral formally established the Verdania Accords. Astral had grown into its full adult form over the months following the battle, now standing nearly 3 meters tall with scales that shifted through every color imaginable. But despite its majestic appearance, it still preferred to spend quiet moments with Will and Grace, the two humans who had first shown it kindness when it was a dying infant. 50 years ago, Astral spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that could be understood by any sentient being. "My people faced extinction because others feared what we could do. Today we choose to use those same abilities not for dominance but for cooperation." Will stood beside his old friend, still wearing the simple farmer's clothes he had always preferred. At 70, his hair was completely gray now, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. The galaxy had offered him titles and honors beyond counting, but he had turned them all down. He was a farmer, he said, and Verdania Prime needed its crops tended. "The Verdania Accords represent a new way of thinking," Will said to the assembled delegates. "Not about who's strongest or who can force others to obey, but about what we can build together." The Accords were unlike any treaty in galactic history. Instead of establishing territories or trade agreements, they created frameworks for cooperation that transcended species boundaries. Drakmori knowledge would be shared freely with any civilization that committed to peaceful development. In return, other species would contribute their own unique abilities to collective projects that benefited everyone. The former Admiral Crone, now calling himself simply Teacher Crone, had become one of the most effective advocates for the new alliance. His transformation from genocidal military commander to peaceful educator served as proof that even the most hardened hearts could be changed. He worked tirelessly to help other former hegemony officers understand their new roles in a galaxy based on cooperation rather than conquest. "I spent 40 years believing that order could only be maintained through fear," Crone told a gathering of former military personnel. "Prince Astral and the humans of Verdania Prime showed me that true order comes from mutual respect and shared purpose." The changes were evident everywhere throughout known space. Worlds that had been strip-mined for resources were now being restored using Drakmori healing techniques, combined with human agricultural knowledge. Species that had been enemies for centuries were working together on projects that would have been impossible for any single civilization to accomplish alone. Dr. Helen Park had become the head of the Galactic Health Initiative, using enhanced medical technology to eliminate diseases that had plagued dozens of species for millennia. Bob Wright led engineering teams that built space habitats where multiple species could live together comfortably, each environment tailored to different biological needs while maintaining social connections. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy's children were educated. Young beings from every species were brought to Verdania Prime to learn not just academic subjects, but how to think beyond the limitations of their own cultures. They played together in fields where earth crops grew alongside plants from 100 different worlds, all thriving in harmony. Kate Stone, now Director of Interspecies Relations, often watched these children with amazement. 5 years ago, if you had told me that a human child and a hegemony warrior's offspring would be best friends, I would have thought you were crazy. Now it's just normal. The economic transformation was equally remarkable. Instead of competing for scarce resources, civilizations now focused on abundance creation. Drakmori matter manipulation techniques could turn asteroids into garden worlds. Human agricultural innovations could make any environment fertile. Other species contributed their own unique abilities to an economy based on growth rather than scarcity. Trade relationships evolved into true partnerships. The crystal forests of the Altarian Republic provided materials for Drakmori technology, while human farmers taught them sustainable growing techniques. The deep space builders of the Rigel Confederacy worked with Drakmori architects to create space stations that were living ecosystems rather than sterile metal structures. On the 5th anniversary of the Verdania Accords, representatives from over 300 civilizations gathered on the now famous farming world. The ceremony took place in the same field where Will had first found a dying alien child, though that field had been transformed into a vast amphitheater made of living crystal and growing plants. Will, now recognized as the first human Drakmori ambassador, spoke to the assembled representatives. 5 years ago, Grace and I made a simple choice. We saw a creature that was hungry and afraid, and we decided to help. We had no idea that our choice would change the galaxy, but maybe that's the point. The biggest changes often start with the smallest acts of kindness. Astral stood beside him, its scales creating patterns of light that conveyed emotions words could never capture. The humans taught us something we had forgotten during our long persecution, the Drakmori prince said. They showed us that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to protect and nurture what is precious. The celebration that followed lasted for 3 days and nights, with representatives sharing food, music, and stories from their homeworlds. Children from dozens of species played together, while their parents negotiated new cooperation agreements. Artists collaborated on works that combined multiple aesthetic traditions into something entirely new. But the most moving moment came when Grace, now 75 and using a walking stick made from Drakmori crystal, stood to address the gathering. The woman who had first suggested they call the alien child Ember had become a grandmother figure to beings across the galaxy. People ask me what it feels like to be part of something this big, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the amphitheater. But to me it doesn't feel big at all. It feels like what it's always been. It's about taking care of each other. It's about making sure no one goes hungry or afraid. It's about building something good for our children and grandchildren. She gestured toward the audience, where human children sat next to young Drakmori, while offspring of former hegemony species played with beings whose names Earth still didn't have words for. This is what normal should look like. Different people, different species, all taking care of each other. As the ceremony concluded, Will and Grace walked slowly back to their farmhouse, now expanded to accommodate the constant stream of visitors but still fundamentally the same home, where they had raised an alien prince as their own child. Astral walked beside them, occasionally pausing to encourage the growth of a struggling plant or to heal a minor injury in one of the many animals that still called the farm home. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to check the wheat field that morning? Grace asked as they settled onto their porch to watch the sunset. Will considered the question, looking out over fields where earth grain grew alongside crops from a dozen other worlds, where human farmers worked beside alien refugees who had found new homes on Verdania Prime. In the distance, he could see the spires of the Galactic Cooperation Center, where representatives from hundreds of civilizations worked together on projects that would benefit everyone, I think someone else would have found Astral eventually, he said finally. Maybe not in time to save its life, but someone would have tried. That's what people do when they see something that needs help. At least it's what they should do. Astral settled beside their chairs, its adult form still somehow managing to curl up like the small creature they had first found. The Drakmori prince had the power to reshape matter and energy, to lead civilizations and command fleets. But it still preferred these quiet moments with the two humans who had first shown it that the galaxy could be a place of kindness rather than cruelty. As the stars came out above Verdania Prime, Will reflected on how much had changed since that morning 5 years ago. The galaxy was now a place where former enemies worked together, where children of different species played as friends, where abundance was created rather than hoarded. It was a place where a simple act of feeding a hungry child had grown into something magnificent, but at its heart, it was still about the same simple truth that had guided Will and Grace from the beginning. When you see someone who needs help, you help them. When you find something precious, you protect it. When you have the chance to build something good, you do it together. The wheat in Will's fields rustled softly in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed across a galaxy that had finally learned to call itself home.